Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jill Seibel, and as of today, I'm your invisible Associate Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education, Professor of Biological Sciences here at Virginia Tech. And I will be co-facilitating today's webinar along with Corin Jones from the Department of Biological Sciences. It's really my great honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bryan Dewsbury, Associate Professor of Biology at the University of Rhode Island, as our speaker for the Department of Biological Sciences 10th Annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Seminar. Dr. Dewsbury grew up in Trinidad and Tobago and came to the United States to study biology, first as an undergraduate at Morehouse College, and then on to Florida International University for master's and PhD degrees, also in biology. He then became a faculty member at the University of Rhode Island, where he teaches and oversees a research program in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning with expertise in equity and inclusion. Among his projects and achievements are serving as a fellow of the John N. Gardner Institute, and those of us working in first-year experience programs are quite familiar with this institute and their work. He is also a PI for a Science and Education Society, or SEAS, research program with a very multifaceted approach to inclusion, education, and STEM. Dr. Dewsbury serves in many leadership roles in the STEM education domain, including on the advisory board of the CUBES Consortium, which promotes effective practices in quantitative undergraduate biology education. I've been a fan of Dr. Dewsbury's scholarship for some time now, especially in the current work I'm doing with a number of Virginia Tech colleagues leading our Howard Hughes Medical Institute Inclusive Excellence Grant Program. But as I was preparing for this introduction, I kind of treated myself this week with some quiet time to go back and read Bryan's work just as a learner, more at a leisurely pace, not trying to write a paper or a proposal. And now that we are 4 years into our own inclusive excellence work, it really struck me how much Bryan has influenced the rather radical departure that Howard Hughes has been asking us to make in our approach to promoting the success of students who have historically been marginalized and minoritized in STEM. The focus on knowing ourselves as faculty and people as a first step to knowing our students, calling out that deficit mindset that we often bring to this work, even very unconsciously, and also just focusing on relationships. I really came to appreciate this week just how grounded that is in Dr. Dewsbury's scholarship. At the same time, Bryan writes to us as a fellow scientist. And while I find his work challenging, I'm always learning something new, it's also very accessible. He meets us as science faculty where we are, acknowledges the constraints that we face, for example, teaching really large lecture classes, and then still manages to really inspire and guide us to make meaningful changes just the same. So I personally am super excited for what I will learn today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bryan Dewsbury and his presentation, Intelligence plus Character, Education as a Force for Liberation. Welcome, Bryan. I turn things over to you.
Thanks, Jill. Corinne, could you just give me a quick thumbs up that you see my presentation screen? Yeah, thanks for that great introduction. I think I particularly liked how you phrased what myself, my colleagues, my research program, the other people with whom I've had the pleasure to do this kind of work with are trying to do. Any discussion about inclusion, diversity, equity, and social justice are not easy conversations. And we take pride in the fact that when we try to have these conversations, we are not trying to come out there to demonize people. We are not trying to come out there just to call out bad behavior. We are trying to build community. 100+ years of scholarship on teaching as an act of freedom points to that this environment cannot be created if we are not invested in cultivating community. That means community in our classrooms. That means community among ourselves, with our colleagues, with staff, with administration, with people from other campuses. That has to be the mindset. And it's been a few years now, and I've been, in spite of all the bad news that we may have endured over the last half decade or so, I am actually still encouraged with what I see. I'm encouraged that the kinds of things people are asking for from their professional development, from the literature, from the funding agencies are much more sophisticated than it was in the 2000s. And as we celebrate MLK holiday this week, I just want us to take some time to kind of reflect on what we need to be asking ourselves, what we need to be asking of our colleagues, and what we need to be asking of the education system, right? That is that in order for it to be in a position that prepares students for a life of meaning and purpose and civic responsibility. I'm honored to be here. I really am. These are very special events in university life, so I don't take it lightly. I do hope, I trust that your devotion to the principles that MLK has espoused throughout its entire life go beyond our discussion here today, and that you find ways to infuse his message of hope and love and justice and community throughout your academic calendar, year, even in the summer when you're not there. But to the extent that this is a launching point for that kind of mentality and your own journeys, right? Let us take a minute to kind of reflect on perhaps the undiscovered power of some of his language. One of the things that I have the privilege to do is travel the country, well, pre-COVID, travel the country and work with institutions of higher education on faculty development, on inclusive teaching practices. And invariably, so I get a call a lot, right? We want to work on our syllabus or do inclusive practices. And by and large, a lot of universities and colleges don't always know what they want. They know they want something inclusive and, can you come and tell us what you want, sort of thing. And I think actually 3-4 years ago when this began, it was like, oh, you're a Black dude who speaks well. Can you come and tell us about race? And we'll all feel good about ourselves, right? So I think we've matured since that point. So I'm happy that that's no longer the case, right? But when I go, I want to ask hard questions, right? I want to know that what you're going to do as an institution is relevant to problems that you've identified, right? I don't want this kind of blanket, here's the 10 things you do, and then if you do them by Monday, everything will be okay, right? So you want to ask yourself, you want to interrogate your practices at the very highest level, because that is when your procedures will matter. But as it pertains to faculty, I very often ask the question, if you met your students 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, what would you hope they'd be doing? What would you hope, what kind of individuals would you hope they are? And even if I can do a research study that quantified those answers, it would all kind of thematically code around the fairly same themes. They want good voters. They want you to critically look at evidence and not be duped by politicians, by the media. You want to be good brothers, good neighbors, good parents, good community, give back, lift as you climb. They want all these great philosophical things for that future person. And then yet when they're in the classroom, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, listen, don't leave here today thinking that Bryan came to tell us that our chapters don't matter. This is not what I am saying, all right? I'm a lover of knowledge, so, by all means, the intellectual content of your classroom is very important. But what MLK and others, like John Dewey, like Paulo Freire, like Ira Shaw, have been telling us for years, that education is more than just delivering stuff. And so when you tell me that you want people 10, 15, 20 years from now to have all of these kind of social behavioral skills, the question you have to ask yourself now is, what are the things you are doing in your classroom now that prepares them for those kinds of behaviors? In other words, don't assume that because they can do a Punnett square, or because they can explain photosynthesis, or because they can read the sound and fury, automatically means all those other qualities will happen. And honestly, I'm not even blaming you. I'm actually fascinated by the career of professors. Because you think about it. If you want to be a lawyer, what do? You become an English major, a political science major, then you go to law school, then you get a job. If you want to be a doctor, you take science classes mostly, then you go to med school, right? If you want to be, I don't know, a business owner, you take an MBA class. If you want to teach in a college classroom, what do? Right? You fall in love with a particular narrow area of science, you go to grad school to become an expert in that, then you get a job in a university. Oh, by the way, could you teach this class? Very few of us, my friends, were actually specifically prepared for what we do. And in fact, I will take it a step further. I challenge you to write 15 things that you do, and this particular comment is for faculty. Write 15 things you do as a faculty member that's important for your job. And identify how many of those things you were actually prepared to do, prepared for when you were a graduate student. So stay at the bench, stay at the bench, stay at the bench, publish, boom, faculty position. Now you have to manage grants, you have to oversee people, you have to teach a class. So we have this weird system. And I know it's getting better, right? There are some ways now grad students can get better training to teach and things like that. But that's more the exception than the rule right now, right? So we have this weird system where you're not even really taught to think about teaching as a skill, as something that you have to learn and practice and suck at and then get critiqued and get better at, right? So it is no surprise, my friends, that we end up in a predicament where many of us don't even discuss these principles. And I'm saying this from experience. Right? I have the privilege of being married to an elementary school teacher. And, every so often when we talk to each other about what we're doing and I tell her about the workshops that I give, and she look at me like, you're now hearing about that for the first time? Like, what? But it really? Paulo? Nobody? Okay. All right. She's like, all right. Future is in good hands, right? And, I could tell you from experience, man, like I was a marine science graduate student back in the day, and when I fell in love with teaching, the response wasn't good. People felt like that's something anybody could do, and but because I felt it was a calling and not just a job, I stuck to it. But that was the culture. So even though it's getting better, I think we still have a ways to go. So the title of my talk is probably an MLK quote that you've heard before. And what you may not know is that the quote actually comes from a letter that he wrote when he was an undergraduate student at Morehouse College, my alma mater, to the student newspaper called the Maroon Tiger. And it was partly in response to some racist things that were being said by the Georgia governor at that time. And I'll just read you an excerpt from what he said. And it says, the function of education, therefore, is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. But education which stops with efficiency may prove the greatest menace to society. The most dangerous criminal may be the man gifted with reason, but no morals. You can solve all the Punnett squares you want, my friend. You can do all that stuff. If you're not embedding that respect for humanity in that experience, you can have all the skills in the world. And we have living examples of this. We have living examples of this. It might be tempting to look at this image or wherever you were last Wednesday, 2 Wednesdays ago, and think, it's the dregs of the earth. It's those who weren't educated. It's those who don't know better and don't believe in democracy. My friends, among them were lawyers. Among them were business owners. Among them were ministers. And in a weird repeat of history, in the 1920s, when lynching was taking over the South, who was that led by? Ministers and business people and lawyers. These are people who went to our colleges. Okay? So they did the reasoning, they did the classes, but yet you leave with a different interpretation of your society and your responsibility to that society. So sometimes people ask, and I don't want to be the arrogant outsider, right? I'm on a journey too, like everybody else, and people ask about my own kind of entry into teaching and inclusive teaching. And I didn't go to a workshop that blew my mind. I didn't read a paper that, I must follow this because so-and-so said it. All those things are fine. I was a grad student who, when I was in grad school, was explicitly told, the less time you can spend teaching, the better. And at 23, which is when I started grad school, I followed that advice. I avoided teaching. I actually got an RA-ship to do my master's. But of course, RAs are harder to come by for PhD. So when I came back to do PhD, I was quote unquote forced to teach. And I say this with all the humility in the world because I don't think everybody gets to have this experience. I know a lot of people have jobs that they like, maybe even love. But when I started teaching as a PhD student, I felt something in me that I couldn't describe. And as much as I enjoyed scuba diving in warm South Florida, as much as I enjoyed studying seagrasses and doing the math and all of that stuff, it really was fun. But being in that classroom was a calling. And the reason why you use the word calling versus this is just something I love is a calling. When you are called, you respond. And when you are called, you don't just respond in a moment, you respond on a continuous basis. So everything you do in the context of that calling is in response to something greater. Yes, it is nice to have the paycheck. Yes, it is nice to be promoted, right? Yes, it is nice to build the social and the political capital. But what you're chasing, Hennessy has a commercial like, what's your wild rabbit? What the wild rabbit you're chasing is something bigger, right? So everything you do, whether it's the paper you write, the way I teach a class, the podcast that I'm on, the movies I've helped design, whatever I do is in service of that purpose. That's what matters. And a big part of this, just a quick digression, I'll get back to this, is, when I started this job, one of the most infuriating pieces of advice I used to get, well-meaning, but infuriating, your job is to get tenure. How is that a job? How is that a job? Tenure is something that measures the degree to which you have met some expectations. But as Kathy O'Neill rightly says in her book, Weapons of Math Destruction, sometimes the assessment mechanism gets divorced from the thing it's assessing. And so if you're just chasing the assessment, you can miss the boat, man. So are you really measuring teaching? Is just collecting popularity surveys from students actually a measurement of teaching? Are you supporting that? Are you supporting the development of people who can actually teach in a classroom? How are your hiring practices? Are you looking for that evidence of high quality pedagogy? So, but if the calling and if the purpose is equity through the education process, it then means that sometimes, instead of writing those 2 extra papers, I'm working with a school to transform the department. Sometimes it means instead of writing another obscure manuscript, right, I'm recording a podcast because that will reach more people. I'm in service of the mission. And the people who taught me that, my friends, is this wonderful group of students who are, this is the first class I've ever taught. And oh my goodness, was I awful. Of course I was awful. I didn't know what I was doing. The person who ran the TA training literally told me, you're a funny guy, you'll be fine. So entrust the education of the future leaders of this land to a guy who apparently was a little funny. But I talked to them, I heard their story. You know, I'm a fairly social person. So even when we're running labs, there's a lot of downtime when we talk. And you know, one of the questions you would ask is, you know, why, so a lot of these students were pre-med or pre-health of some type. And I would ask why, like why that career, right? And of course you have to kind of do the back and forth thing, right? They would start saying, oh, I just want to help people. All right, well, okay, I got a lot of help in the grocery. You want to do that? But then they say, oh, well, you know, I grew up going to doctors. Well, you also grew up going to the post office. So why? But then eventually, once you sort of push the conversation, you get to things like, pero mi abuela dice, but my grandmother said, but my uncle said, but my mother said. And so they were being told, you have to choose this as a career because this is the career that will allow this family to be economically mobile. I taught a lot of first generation Americans. I taught a lot of first generation college students whose family deciphered that in order to move up the American economic ladder, you had 3 very specific careers to choose from: medicine, law, and apparently engineering was in 3rd. I don't know why, I don't know who made the rules, but that was the order. All right? So what that means is when they're in class, while we're here, we love biology. You know, look at this great butterfly species I study from Nebraska. Why aren't you excited? They're like, nah, kid, I need a letter grade to go to med school. Like, this is the stakes of my presence in this class. There's a whole family riding on this, right? So I'm not really here to learn, actually. I'm here to get a grade, which is a completely different approach to the class, right? So I've given other talks where I kind of go in detail how that experience just really radicalized my approach to the curriculum. We completely redesigned it. We brought in their parents. I mean, we just did a slew of things because there's a quote from Elizabeth Mohay at Michigan State. She likes to say, I don't teach subjects, I teach students. So if your mindset is I teach subjects, then you want to know, okay, you know, you have to make this active, you have to make everybody have fun, you have to, you know, cover this amount of material, you know. Again, I reiterate, coverage matters. You have to, you know, you're gonna have to talk about something. This is, you know, in science is fun, classes are fun, not hating. But when you talk about teaching students, you are cultivating the individual. You are asking yourself, what are the things I need to do to make this person grow? And some of those things have nothing to do with what's in your textbook. All of those things have to do with how much you understand who's in front of you, both from a macro and a micro perspective. Macro meaning the state of college students today, you know, as millennials or whatever you want to label them as. The students coming into your school, do you know something about the communities from which they've come from, right? Do you have a general data set about food insecurity on your campus? Do you have university climate survey? Like, do you have a sense of how students are responding to your school's academic offerings? Macro. Micro. Do you know who's in front of you? Do you actually know them, or are they just a student ID number who could really be anybody? So I want to share with you two quick things that I do to kind of move our relationship beyond just that ID number. Let me give you a little bit of context. Number one, the class I'm speaking about in particular is Intro Bio. And I've maintained for years that this is a class, it's my favorite class, hands down. It's more about the intro than the bio. I like bio. I love it actually. It's more about the intro than the bio. If I can't get them to spiritually engage with this experience, if I can't get them to connect themselves, their whole selves to what we're doing, I don't really care what active learning tricks you're trying. Inclusion comes before that stuff. So it's a largish class, 150. It's, the first of a 2-semester series, and I just teach the first semester. And as you can probably tell from perhaps the little I've shared with you, that there are a lot of moving parts. People like to ask, well, are you an active learning person or problem-based? I'm like, I don't really do with the titles. We just get buckets. We have learning outcomes. We make sure those learning outcomes are met. And that's what we do. So we draw our strategies from the information on the ground. Yes, there is active learning. Yes, there is things they do outside of class. Yes, we do all of that stuff. But our focus is cultivating the student, right? So before I meet them, and so class usually begins the Wednesday after Labor Day. And I have a full roster by mid-August. And I asked them to write me an essay. This essay is due the first week of class. Your taxpayers' dollars are going to fund National Public Radio, so please go use this. Think of it as a return on your investment. And they have a wonderful series called I Believe. It's an oral essay series, obviously, because it's radio. But if you go to this website, to the specific website, you actually will get guidelines for educators should you be interested in this. And I actually started using this when I was a grad student, and I didn't do it for research purposes. I just did it because I just thought it was cool. And I remember what I used to do because I taught the same set of students for like 3 or 4 years. I had them write this essay as first year students, and then at the end of it, when they graduated, they wrote it like by hand, and then when they graduated, I framed it and gave it to them as a gift, to have them kind of read the I Believe essay from when they were first year students to when they graduated. So it was a really nice experience. I have since then used this as a pedagogical tool in my intro bio class. Class starts Wednesday. I clear my schedule on Thursday and I read every single one of them. And if you go to the link, you will see that the prompt talks about the values that have shaped your deepest passions. Look into your soul and tell me your why. Why are you in this class? Like, why you chose this major? Why, 500 words or less, 1 page. And I guarantee you ask your students to do that, you'll be floored. You'll be floored. We are a bunch of assumers as faculty. We always assume we know what's good for the kids, and perhaps we do on some level. But I'm always amazed that Paulo Freire has this term he calls banking, which is this idea when you teach, you're just kind of depositing information into empty receptacles, as opposed to dialogue when you're actually engaging, with how people are investing within the experience. So we do this not only in classroom pedagogy, but we do it administratively, right? We come up with programs and solutions, and ask most African countries who receive aid, and they'll tell you, right? They come up with all the solutions on how to solve every problem without actually talking to the people that it's supposed to impact, right? So I'm putting this to you as a mechanism to begin that dialogue. then I'm going to ask you to follow up that dialogue. What do I mean by that? And you might be saying, Bryan, I teach a class of 300. Come on. You really think I'm going to find each one of them and talk to them about their life for 45 minutes? That is not what I mean. And what I would ask of you is to perhaps expand your definition of what dialogue means. If you are thinking of your practice as teaching students but not subjects, then dialogue becomes every interaction you have with a student in any scenario. So I have had students who've taken my class, gone on, graduated, or still in school or whatever, have come up to me and it was when you said blah blah blah, it really changed my thinking on what I wanted to do. I don't remember what I said, but it doesn't matter. They remember. So whenever I am speaking, whenever I'm interacting with them, whether it's me lecturing in class, explaining something, giving motivational advice, whether it's the email exchanges I have, because I may not get to see you, whether it's when I'm walking down the corridor pre-COVID and I run into somebody on my way to class or on my way to anywhere, whether it's the 5 minutes when they all come up to you at the podium right after class, whether it's the student hours that we have, 30 or 35 show up every week, so it's a smaller group, whatever it is, we're in a mode of how are you cultivating as a person, right? So I'm not just asking, did you get your problem set right? What's your plans for after this class? Oh, really? Why? Well, what made you choose that? And you just never know. These little things are ways to kind of build on this trust that you've cultivated at the beginning. We've had a really fabulous time in Intro Bio. And I've given other talks, kind of perhaps more research talks that have shown that to do these inclusive practices, we've cut the content, 40-45%. And we actually track the students into upper division classes and have shown that even with that content reduction, the students coming from my section have performed better than students in sections where they were trying to cover the entire textbook. And that's because we took as a guiding philosophy that our course, the Intro to Intro Bio, is really teaching students how to be self-learners. It's teaching students how to be comfortable and confident with material, even when Bryan Dewsbury is not standing right next to them trying to explain it to them, right? Preparing them for life, right? John Dewey said that education is not preparation for life, it's life itself. So we treat the class like that. And we try to embed the skills so that when you are in the other aspects of your life, you can use those skills. And, the good news is that then, people, sort of skeptics, not so much skeptics, but as people see the evidence of that process, they're more willing to engage and ask. And a lot of the conversations I've had, perhaps in a lot of my work really in the last year and a half, it's getting more towards that institutional change, right? So I'm happy for, a few faculty here and there to really start thinking about inclusion and thinking about social justice in STEM classes. But how does the institution support that? So I want to briefly kind of explain what I call a model for critically conscious engagement, and that term comes from Paulo Freire's work, because the field of STEM education research, to the extent that it is a field, I feel has evolved a little bit. Well, has it evolved? Okay, it was a kind of a weird pendulum swing, I'll put it that way. Before I show that, 10, 15 years ago, it was students this, students that, students couldn't do anything, students never came to class prepared, they weren't like the students I had, and so all the student blame was taking place, right? And thankfully that got put to bed, And it became of this focus on faculty, and faculty don't care, and faculty are racist, and faculty and faculty. And I actually don't find either kinds of language very helpful, because in spite of my tone, this is MLK week, right? And one of the reasons why I love MLK and his work and his writing is that he comes at his speeches and his writings from a place of love. I do believe that even some of the most intransigent people, who may seem at least intransigent, or seem just ideologically opposed to any of the kinds of things we're talking about, I do believe in better angels. And quite frankly, if I didn't, I don't know if I could do this work. If this was just all going to be about complaining and demonizing and white people are this and that, no. I don't actually use that language, because I'm looking for the model where we could all lock arms and do this together, right? So instead of this, like, it's students or it's faculty, let's talk about systems, because I actually don't believe a student gets up in the morning and says, I just paid $8,000 in tuition. Let me see how many Fs I can get. This is my goal here. I'm gonna make a plan to fail, because that really is how I want to spend this money. I actually don't think that happens, right? I also don't believe that a faculty member gets up and says, if only 2 students can pass this class, that would be great. And I'm actually saying this even for classes where that might actually happen. I think deep down, that's not the desire. So if you're willing to be naive with me, my friends, the question you really have to ask is, how do you design a system to enable both of these very important actors to be their best selves? What are the support mechanisms? What is the paradigm? I would argue that in a perfect world, because I said in revolution, we backward design, right? Backward design means there needs to be a vision for which we can work towards. I say in a perfect world, even in a not so perfect world, Diane Ravitch, K-12 scholar, talks about you want students showing up well-fed. Don't assume that always happens. Well-fed and drama-free, so that they can be fully engaged in the education process. So they should see and feel represented. They should see examples of themselves. They should feel like they have it within them, and they will have the support around them to pursue whatever they would like on your campus. They don't see the instructor as an impediment, as a barrier, as a wall to overcome. That's somebody they can connect to as a support structure. I'm not saying you have to be their best friend, but I'm saying that you have to be on their side. They are open to the awakening of the soul. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you are just going to spend how many ever years at college to just reinforce the same beliefs that you have for the first 18 years of your life, that's where the whole reasoning but no morals thing comes from. You can, it's again, it's sort of the structure of higher ed, right? It's this mentality that the value of this experience is concentrated on the 120 credit hours needed for that diploma, when you could learn just as much, if not more, from the people you've met from different backgrounds, from the difficult conversations you have with them about race and class and prejudice and social justice, from the times you spend in the lab and the field and the countries you go to, for study abroad. The out of class experience sometimes gets dismissed as a student affairs things, and they have like co-curricular extra. It's not extracurricular, it's part of the curriculum. It's the curriculum, right? So the in-class part is just part of it. So the soul gets awakened. You have to create a culture where I can both completely disagree with you, but still respect your humanity. And yes, we can do that in a science class. So therefore, The instructor needs to have that mindset. They need to be able, and I know most of us, at least we're not brought up in a graduate school environment that kind of taught this, but you need to see beyond the content. Again, not that content doesn't matter, but it's just part of what the academic experience is like. And you understand the social context of education. So I was telling a group earlier, when I came to Rhode Island, I had to do my homework. A lot of my marginalized students come from communities in Providence, Rhode Island that were victims of redlining. If you don't know what that process is, it was a process in the 1920s, my friend, a federally sanctioned process where the loans were denied to people of color for 40 years until the Housing Act in 1968. Providence settled a lawsuit, a redlining lawsuit in 2014. So before we start talking about what students can and can't do, think about what goes into ending up in particular communities and how those communities are served. And who tends to be the victims of that? So quite frankly, the fact that you are in my class and trying to do well, man, I applaud you. So the class has to be a space of uplift, while other aspects of my program try to work on some of these broader social issues of inequity. So we need to at least understand that. And so the system needs to be structured so that the components can be their best selves. This could be a talk by itself. And it's, I really hope they are, well, I know there's at least one administrator among us, even though I haven't seen her face, Jill Sybil. But this is where I think administrators have to be challenged. Everybody wants to put out a Black Lives Matter statement. I almost want to do a research project this summer coming. I want to quantify the amount of Black Lives Matter statements I saw put out after George Floyd, and then see how many of those institutions did something after that statement and what they did. The statement's the easy part. Having an MLK Day celebration is the easy part. But when we start talking about the policies in your university, that's when we start to see how brave you're willing to be. Are you willing to look at how you compensate your teaching faculty versus your research faculty? Are you willing to look at how you support people trying to do inclusive strategies in their classroom? Are you willing to look at how you promote and grant tenure to people based on what? Are you willing to look at your hiring practices and people on hiring committees and what constitutes evidence for inclusive teaching? Are you willing to institutionalize hearing student voice, running focus groups, like large ones, and getting that feedback and acting on it? Are you willing to do what it takes to diversify your faculty? These aren't easy questions, they aren't cheap questions, but they are the questions. That's the system. Because at the end of the day, my friends, this is America. You can write all the statements you want, but how you communicate what you value is through your incentive structure. How you communicate what you value is what you reward and what you support. Everything else is lip service. Because here's what, and I've seen this play out at my own school, at other schools. People know they could suck in the class, get 9 papers out a year, and still get promoted. They know it. So the ones who show up to faculty development, show up to the workshops and the showcase and stuff, that's the choir, right? It's low-hanging fruit. They'll show up anyway, and it's good. The choir needs to practice. I get all of that, right? But if you looking to scale, look at the policies. That's where the change begins. And that's the hard part. I've seen the bravery happen. I'm not, and I hope for you. I know, Jill's leading some incredible things with HHMI, and that's where you start, right? You start by developing a proof of principle, and then you learn some things, then you scale. And I think that's the way to go. But just know that those are the questions that are coming. And that's where this turns from, just a conversation about MLK, just about inclusion, just about social justice, to this is what we value at Virginia Tech. I have a interesting history. I turned 41 in a month, and time flies, boy. I feel like I just came to America back in 1999 with my little F1 visa in hand, and I'm the last of 3 children. I grew up in a house of my dad's a retired pastor. My mom was an accountant, and so I grew up going to church all the time. I don't really practice anymore. I'm gonna ask you not to tell my parents that. But in some interesting ways, I think the ways in which my father approached his ministry, I've taken with me to my class. So I don't bring the Bible to class. Although I am tempted to take up offering sometimes. Not gonna lie. But in terms of the classroom being this holy space, this special place where there's some meaning in us being together and breaking bread and having fellowship and rooting for each other and aiming for just this better version of ourselves and this cultivation of meaning. That's what it is, man. And that, and I struggle with it because sometimes people want they want the best practices, and I get it. I'm not hating on that, but what makes this experience so valuable are the intangibles. Things that I can't put in a regression model, things that I can't put in a spreadsheet, right? And the nonverbal cues. And so the people who I've worked with over the years have been theater professors. I kid you not, right? Who work with thespians, and you talk about reading body language and creating connection. And but I am a first generation college student. So I was fortunate to go to Morehouse College on a scholarship. But I know what I was doing. I mean, I knew what I was doing in terms of I can get a grade here and there, but it was a little bit of a struggle. I think the first year was good, and then came physics. Then things weren't so good. I don't believe in curving. I don't curve in my class, but I'll tell you right now, if that teacher didn't curve that semester, this would have been a very different story. And this picture you're looking at is a bench in the middle of Morehouse's campus. It's still there because I just went back a year ago. And at the end of orientation week, which my parents stayed for, which is something first generation parents do, by the way. My parents kind of sat me down on that bench, and my dad looked at me and said, "I've brought you this far. Good luck." And I didn't really know what he meant by that. I was 19, but I get it now. When you're a first generation college student and your parents didn't go to college, they can't sit with you and talk about use metacognitive strategies and make sure and seek extra help and make sure you're explaining this to somebody. So when I got that C+ in physics and my scholarship was on the line, they were like, "Well, you gave it a shot." And if it wasn't for some particularly caring professors who saw me struggling and sat me down to address my psychological self and teach me that, yeah, you can do this, you'll be fine. Let's get to the specifics of why you're struggling. If it wasn't for them, I would not be here before you today. So everything I do in the classroom is out of gratitude and respect and thanks to professors who played that role in my life and allowed me to really enjoy what I'm doing. I lift as I climb. So when I'm in intro bio, It's not, research faculty kind of run away from intro classes because, it affects their research program. That's a class I will teach until I retire, because that's where all the differences can be made. It's more about intro than it's about bio. And that intro means that when we teach, we don't just teach the textbook. We don't just teach the content. We don't just teach the skills, all of which is important. But we embed meaning, we embed purpose, and we give opportunities for them to develop character. I thank you so much, so much. I will leave my contact information. I know we have a little bit of time for questions, but I just want to leave this up here just in case people want to come find me afterwards electronically and have a question a week, 2-3 weeks from now. And we always like to keep this conversation going. Thanks to Dr. Moore, Dr. Civil, Corin, all the good people who saw it fit to have me here. I hope next time it's actually in Blacksburg, because not gonna lie, right? Wouldn't it be way more fun with a happy hour after? Just saying. Okay. All right. I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Bryan, thank you so much. Thank you for your wisdom, your passion, and especially for elevating those really hard questions. We talk about them a lot, but they can't be said enough. So grateful to you. Corin actually has full host privileges, so I think Corin is going to lead our Q&A. If you want to type questions, audience, in the chat to panelists and attendees, then we'll both see them, and I'll try to catch anything that Corin might not see. And we absolutely owe you a happy hour when conditions permit, Bryan. But I will stop talking and let Corin bring some questions forward, and I'll join in if I see anything.
Okay, awesome. We'll start off with a question from Florian, which says, Bryan, do you share your "This I Believe" essay with your students, and do you think that we should?
I do, and yes, I think you should. So I write my own. I don't share the students' essays with each other because, well, you just write differently if you know you're writing just for the professor versus everybody else. But I do write my own "This I Believe" essay. In fact, I write a new one every year, and I read it aloud to them. And I think that's important in building the trust.
Awesome. The next question that I have up is awesome presentation, which I agree with. So what
not a question.
So what is the most challenging situation you've addressed with a student?
Most challenging I have what with a student?
What's the most challenging situation that you've addressed with the students?
Oh boy, could make a long list. I'll give 2 quick examples that were challenging. One, because it highlights my own need to be committed to personal growth. This was just a couple of years ago. A young lady, at the start of class, we still had a textbook at that point, and we used Pearson, and they have this whole online courseware thing, and she hadn't logged online, she hadn't done anything, and so I would go to her and say, come see me afterwards, because I haven't seen you on the platform. And she'd say, yeah, I'll come see you, and then she wouldn't show up. And I emailed a few times, she still wouldn't show up, and I think the next time in class I said, look, I'm here late, I'm here after 6, feel free to come by, and then she still wouldn't. And then so I started to get worried, because I knew if she didn't start getting the course materials, it'd be a bit of a wash, a tough start. So we have a service on campus, which is beautiful. It's called Early Alert. And this is an office who has staff dedicated to kind of extraordinary situations. So I contacted them, and they're friends of mine. And I gave them her contact, and they have their way of reaching out. And they took a couple of tries, but they were able to get in touch with her. And my friend from the office called me and said, Bryan, I can't tell you specifically what's going on for privacy reasons, but I could tell you that one of the reasons she didn't come see you is because she was in a situation where she's now uncomfortable seeing men after 6 p.m. And it kind of made me just confront my own implicit bias, like you don't even think, because I was, oh yeah, come see me, my door's open, I'm here till late, and didn't even cross my mind that this could be a thing, and so it was just another kind of gut punch, and it just reminds you that even with your best of intentions, you can still alienate. And the good news is that the office was great. They gave her the support she needed. She stayed in the class, and she's actually mostly thriving now, but that was a tough moment. Another quick one was in 2016 after the election. The day after the election in class, one of the students came to class in just kind of full Trump way, right? Now, one thing that I do is I actually make a point of not talking politics in class. I don't use any president, any political party by name, and I don't give away what I vote for and what I do. We keep it on facts and civic responsibility. I tell them go vote, but I don't say you should do this versus this, right? And he made some people uncomfortable, but I was very impressed with how the students handled it, and nobody engaged it, right? It felt to me there was probably an intent to provoke, but we didn't ask him to take anything off, nothing like that. And we had class, we made a little speech about some of you might be upset, some of you are happy and whatever. And we had class. It was a little weird, but we had class. And later on in the semester, that same young man came back and in a one-on-one meeting with me, he actually said thank you for not engaging him, because he said he felt so out of place at the school that was the only way he felt he knew to kind of get attention to himself, right? And he went on to do some really nice things. I wrote him a nice letter of recommendation. I actually don't know what his political views are. If he's still, I actually don't really care per se. I was more invested in him, and I was really happy, even though he did some things for a while. But I know I said I don't practice Christianity anymore, but I still do the 70 times 7 thing. Like I don't, I'm the Michelle Obama take the high road kind of person, and I said, no, I want this to be about you and your development. However you feel about that, we're not going to make this into that, because once we do that, then this doesn't become an intellectual space anymore. And he got that just by virtue of how we still treated him in spite of what he was trying to do. So it was challenging, but I was really happy with how it worked out. Good question.
Here's another one. How frequently do you meet with your students individually? Do you specifically attempt to have more interactions with students that are struggling, or do you try to make it about equal?
I try to meet more with students who are struggling. So there are other students who will seek me out. There are students who, and I monitor very closely how everybody's doing, and I'll send the kudos, and I'll, reinforcing good language. But I would say a good amount of my time is really spent with these struggling students. And that's where a lot of the psychology of doing an intro class comes in. Just to give you an example, one of the things I do is after 3.5 weeks or so, I have what I call as an early intervention period. What that means is I look at my roster and I look at the bottom 35% of the class, and I email them directly for a one-on-one meeting. Sometimes it takes 2 emails. Sometimes it takes a phone call if they're not responding to email. But I always get to them. Even if it means one time I actually went and knocked on a door in the dorm, because at that point you want to make sure they're alive. No kidding, you actually do. But I email them for a one-on-one meeting, because the way the class is structured, the first summative exam is 15% of your final grade. So yes, it is 50 questions. But even if you get a 0, which nobody gets a 0, but even if you get a 0, you actually still have a way back in the course, right? So what it does is it lets the student and myself know that we need to talk about whatever process they engage in. So it gives me the data that I need to have the conversation, while still giving the student a chance to be relevant and do better as it goes forward. And the last question on the exam is predict your score out of 50. right? And so I have this interesting data set with a predicted score versus the actual score. And now we start talking about, okay, why did you think you're going to get 45 out of 50, but you got 35, right? And that's when we get into, well, okay, well, tell me how you prepared for the exam. And I'll get things like, oh, I was, reading the book. I was up till 3 a.m. So I didn't ask you to tell me how late you stayed up. I asked you to tell me how you prepared, right? So walk me through everything you've done. And that's when we start to get into some of these specific behaviors that we can start to change. And I just want to leave you with this advice. The advice has to be specific to a changeable commodity. It can't just be study harder, because without that intervention and without good advice, they'll just do the same bad strategies 10 times as hard. So you need to find what it is, what specifically thing you're not doing correctly, and then coach them into changing that to a different approach.
This next question goes back to this I believe essay. And the question says, how do you follow up with this I believe essay? You mentioned it's a dialogue, but this person didn't catch how the follow-up was done. So if you could just reiterate on that.
Yeah, no problem. I would say there are different kinds of follow-up. There are certainly some essays that are written where I feel it behooves me to have a private meeting to make sure that they have the supports they think they need as the semester progresses. So there's a little bit of that individual follow-up. Another follow-up is in that early intervention model I just described. When we have that meeting, what I have is I have the summative exam, I have quizzes, I know attendance, which I don't penalize for, but I just know attendance. I know the attendance to learning assistant extra sessions. So I have a lot of academic behavior data, including their essay and including their pre-class survey, so that when we kind of having a conversation about how things are going, it's a holistic conversation, right? Because, I take as a given that when students struggle, this is the intro of the intro bio, when students struggle, it is typically for psychological contingencies and other noise, and not their actual ability to do science. So I want that when we meet and when we discuss that, we are addressing kind of the whole thing. So dialogue occurs in that format. As a general practice, in case this person missed this, I was saying in my speech that any interaction I have when I speak to them in class, right? So I get this I believe essays that talk about, I'm not a science person or whatever. So that means when I'm talking in class about getting ready for an exam or engaging in material, I'm using language to try to change their mindset from fixed to growth, right? When I'm talking in class or using examples, I don't say like, oh, here's a minority scientist you should view. No, I just use examples that are diverse, right? So I create an environment where all of these things are normalized. And that, my friends, is actually part of the dialogue. So I hope that answers your question.
It's a great answer. So the next question is, how do you foster a sense of accountability amongst faculty, particularly those who may have tenure or frankly don't see the value in being more culturally competent? And I want to throw in an extra bit of that, too, especially if you are a new professor, perhaps like in that environment where the power structure might be a little bit different.
Right. Yes. So I'll answer both the original and the thrown in question. So when you're talking about faculty accountability, you are talking about systemic change. And you will have to decide, depending on your professional position within your institution, what you're willing to do to contribute or help bring about systemic change. I understand very much that, especially at the assistant professor level, like I was telling you, the advice I was getting, you're sort of under the gun to conform to a certain extent so that you're guaranteed, to be tenured. And I caution, I don't want to ask you to be Bryan, right? I don't want to ask assistant professors nationwide to take on the job of faculty change. I think this is a question more appropriate for a chair and a dean and a president. And I trust there's some of that among the audience today, because that's kind of an important position where you can bring this about, create structures that incentivize and support people to think about their classrooms differently. There are still ways you can do that once professors become tenured, right? What I will also say though, Corinne, and I want people to listen very carefully to this, because I think a lot of times in higher education, there's a little bit of obsession on how much power you don't have. So when you're an undergrad, you're not as powerful as a grad student. When you're a grad student, you're not as powerful as a professor. When you're an assistant, you're not tenured. When you're tenured, you're not a dean. When you're a dean, you're not a president. You're president, you're not a board of trustees. Trustees is not a governor. I mean, you could go up and up and up, and you're never going to really fully have power. So I just want to maybe reorient that paradigm and just think about the power that you do have, right? You are an assistant professor, and I get the people that you may not be able to impact right now, but you have a classroom, but you have a lab, you have a research program, you have a professional direction that to some extent is of your choosing. That's power that you do have. So perhaps use your bandwidth to figure out how to cultivate that than perhaps worrying too much about those you can't change right now, right? Because as you kind of move up, right, that power niche, or however you want to call it, will expand. And you will be able to, as NSF likes to say, broaden your impacts more than you are now. So let's kind of focus on that, because that's a more positive way to think about it.
That was fantastic. Definitely appreciate that answer. The next question is, in terms of being self-aware, what event in your life or career was a turning point in you becoming more self-aware?
Wow, these are awesome questions. You all practice this? I could think of a couple. Okay, I'll share this one, and this perhaps has less to do with well, not really teaching, but just really truly self-aware. You know, when I was at Morehouse College, for those who don't know, Morehouse is, I think, one of 4 all-male campuses in the country. It's across the street from Spelman, which is all female. Not that it matters, but that's just the case. And I don't know if there were official statistics on this, but when I was there, I was told by friends of mine who identify with the LGBT community that it was probably about 33% gay. Again, never collected data. But it was interesting because you felt it was a little bit of a hidden but understood secret. Not that it should have been a secret, but it just was, you know. And I think it was only really in my last 2 years there was kind of an official club, you know. But, you know, there were people who identify as such, and they were not always open, but sometimes open. And there was an incident where a young man who identified as straight felt that another young man who identified as LGBT made a pass on him. And the straight young man went back to his room, got a baseball bat, and attacked the gay individual. Skull fracture, jaw broken, teeth, and criminal charges were filed. Right? And I didn't swing the bat, right? But like I mentioned to you, I did grow up in a very conservative Christian household. And as a result of that, I had very conservative views about LGBT lifestyles. And I didn't witness the actual attack, but I remember reflecting on feeling a party to that the essays I've written against gay marriage and all of that in my past, you know, came back to make me realize that, you know, MLK says injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And as much as I knew the quote, I didn't live that quote. So that was my road to Damascus moment. You know, I had to think about injustice, not in terms of me happening to be Black and thus about to have a Black man's experience in America. It was about where is injustice writ large, whether it's anti-Black, anti-gay, anti-rural, anti-woman, anti-gender, you know, I had to think and learn about that. And, you know, and I guess what pains me perhaps to this day is feeling like an actor of such extreme violence is what it took for me to do that self-reflection, in the same way that as happy as I was to see the diverse protesters after George Floyd, it took George Floyd, right? And I think some of this work that I'm doing now is me hoping that we don't need to see the worst of humanity in order to do better for others. So that was my self-awareness moment, and hopefully I'm responding to that. But I really thank you for that question, because it was probably one of my most poignant experiences.
It was a big one. Next question is, in your opinion, how has all of the online course delivery affected the quality of your teaching?
It sucks. Actually, okay, let me take that back. It sucks in the sense like I'll always prefer face-to-face. That's how I roll, right? But you know what? Let me tell you a couple of things. Because we actually had a really good inclusive structure set up, it made the transition much easier than so many other classes. So for example, one of the things I do, and I didn't tell you all this, I actually send them a survey before class starts. So there's the essay, right? But then I also send a survey, and the survey asks questions like, what are your pronouns, and what strengths you bring to this course, and what grade you expect to get, et cetera, et cetera. And we just added a question about internet bandwidth, right? So, and I taught in a high flex, so some students were home, some students were in person. So just getting that extra information gave us a sense of, okay, who has resources, who has access to high-speed internet, right? And one of the things with COVID and being at a campus like mine, and I suppose yours, people forget that there are some students, for some students, university is a place of safety, right? So when everybody is told to go back home, some went to homes in the woods looking over lakes and stuff like that, but some went home to sharing one computer with like 6 siblings, right? So we needed to get a sense of that landscape. So because we had a structure in place to get that information, we were able to more quickly respond to where there was needs to address. The other thing was that it was half in person, half on Zoom, and I still had LAs, and they would monitor the chat. And there were a lot of students who, and even told us this, would have not been as willing to share openly in class, were happy to ask questions in the Zoom chat. And I can promise you that not a single time did the Zoom chat go off the rails, right? Nobody, started to talk about pop. It was always, believe in our students, man. They are wonderful people. Like if I was really impressed with, they follow the COVID rules, they stay engaged, our attendance was still 90%. Sometimes there was chats that the LAs would monitor and in person. So, nobody liked it, like in the sense that everybody wished we can be back in person. But in terms of this is what we have to deal with right now, we made the best of it. And I think we all actually had a pretty decent time.
All right, the next question. Mm-hmm. What did those professors who changed your life tell you, and what was your problem?
I can imagine the question. What was your problem, Brian? Like really, what was your, get it together, Brian, get it together. So there were 2 professors in particular. One was my cell bio professor, who, and I was getting a C in the class. I actually ended up with a C+. And, near the end of the semester, he was asking me like, what's going on? Because I actually did really well in intro bio and all of that stuff. And I said, I don't know. I'm reading, I'm studying. I don't know why. I'm doing the past exams. And then he kind of asked me more specifically what I meant by studying, which is, I guess, a line I use today, right? And when he forced me to really articulate what I was doing, he let me know, he realized what was happening. And let me tell you what was happening. I grew up in the Caribbean. And if you do secondary school in the Caribbean, the last 2 years of what you call high school is essentially the same material as the first 2 years of college. Because we took the material, we took something called A levels, which is run by Cambridge, but now it's different, right? But the material was almost equivalent to an associate's degree. So what was happening was that I was seeing a lot of material in my first 2 years of college I had seen already. And I had assumed that, oh, yeah, I've seen this. You know, I could kind of likely skim it and then go and do fine. And I hadn't adjusted my habits to start like really, you know, mastering what I was reading. And he kind of called me on it. He's like, but you're actually not spending a whole lot of time. You tell me if you read once, you do one exam and that's it. Like that's not, you're never gonna really understand this fully. So Dr. Haynes really impacted how I studied. The other person who's actually a good friend and mentor to this day, Dr. Larry Bloomer, he was an ecology professor and I worked in his lab. And since most of the Morehouse biology majors wanted to go on to be medical students, I was like one of 2 students who cared about the environment. Like, well, okay, I shouldn't say that, but cared to make it a career, right? And I think I assumed that because of that, I would just work in his lab until I graduate. And I just be honest with you, I don't think I was very good. I didn't pay as much attention to detail, which is a habit I had to kind of get better at. And he fired me. You know, it was a little awkward, but he fired me. And he fired me, and then we had a conversation afterwards about why he had to do that. And I think it took me losing that opportunity to really start asking my why. Like, why is it I'm really interested in ecology research? And what do I want to do with this? And so when you get your why, then you start taking the things you do every day a bit more seriously. So, you know, between the both of them, I think the last 2 years at Morehouse, you know, I think I averaged like a 3.7 because I was really on the brink after sophomore year. But it just made it a completely different experience. Again, man, these are great questions. So thanks for that. That's what they told me.
So this next question wants to know, when you encounter the mentality that's us versus them, like a faculty versus students mentality, how do you try to connect those groups? I think is summarizing this question a bit.
When you say connect those groups, connect the faculty and the students?
Yeah, so when you have these 2 groups together, like the faculty believe that they're doing these things and it's the students that are not performing, or the students believing that the faculty are not doing these things. How do you cross that boundary to get people to be more connected, I guess, as a group?
In a faculty development scenario, right? You know, it's not terribly difficult, and I'll tell you why. A lot of the faculty that I work with who have taken more of an accommodating mentality, I should say, to their classroom. Many of them came from a place where they either used to be like those other faculty members, or at least didn't really disagree with them. So they understand that it's a bit of a process to change your mentality from that us-them dynamic to one where you are looking for ways to elevate everyone's success. So because I think I have this group that is fairly open and understanding and even, you know, really actually empathetic to this us-them crowd, you know, you actually have more allies in the room who can engage in respectful conversation with faculty members who have that us-them dynamic. And what you find in that, and you know, there's kind of faculty mindset change models out there that speak to this. There's always something behind it. You know, if you keep the conversation going long enough, you will see some of the real reasons why this is what it is, right? I took biochem as an undergrad. It was a required class at the time at Morehouse. And on the first day of class, the professor said that this class is a 90% failure rate. And he said that as a point of pride. And he was right, it did. I was one of the 90%. Like, I mean, but for him, like, he was in that kind of if only 10% pass, that somehow signifies I've done my job. Like there's no way this can be an accommodating environment enough. If it is, then it's obviously too easy. And he had constructed his whole professional identity around that model. So when you come along saying that, no, you should have more small groups, you should have more activities for them to practice, it not only threatens what happens in the class, it threatens the entire vision that individual had of what teaching meant. So as a faculty developer, you have to understand what you're threatening, right? And they don't mean it. They don't mean to be a, insert word here, right? But it's, if you're sort of brought up with that mentality, it's actually fairly difficult to just one day wake up and see a different way of doing things. So yes, it's a little bit of a journey, but just to answer the question directly, because I usually have other people in the room who get that process, get that change process, it's actually fairly easy to support them.
So here's something I'm also curious about. You teach upper level courses? Because we've heard about your love for intro bio, but are you able to, if you teach these courses, are you able to employ similar strategies from your intro bio class into upper level classes? And do you see differences in how upper level students respond to these strategies relative to the intro bio student?
Yes and no. So I do teach one upper level course, and I take each class that I teach as its own, its own body of work, right? Intro bio is more intro than bio. The 300 level class that I teach is not an intro class. So there are less kind of transition related contingencies I have to address than I would in intro bio, right? That being said, it is a very interesting kind of class, and it's a class that I also love. And just as a quick side note, I went to a workshop back when I was a grad student by a guy called D. Fink, and he wrote a really good book called Creating Significant Learning Experiences. He was an emeritus professor at University of Oklahoma, I believe, and he was actually a student of Bloom from Bloom's taxonomy, for those of you who know that word. Anyway, so he had this 4-day workshop, and I was the only person in that workshop who was a grad student. And I told him, like, look, I don't really teach my own class, so, I don't really have a class to work on. And then he said to me, think of a class. If you got a faculty position, think of the dream class you would want to teach and design that. So I designed a class in that workshop that I got to teach, and this is the class I'm about to tell you now, right? And the class is called, What's the Big Idea? And it's a small class, so only 16 students register. And every time I offer the class, we just pick one arresting social problem, right? So for like 2 years ago, we looked at the opioid epidemic in New England, and there was an opioid epidemic in New England. And the goal of the class is to try to solve this problem. If you were a stakeholder, if you were like working for the government, if you were a business leader, a community leader, whatever, and you were to be part of this problem, let's find the root of the problem, let's come up with solutions. And what I love about the class the most is that it's agnostic to discipline. Anybody can register. So we have music majors, we have business majors, we have STEM majors, comp-sci, right? So what they have to do is, define the problem. They have to, get literature on what opioids are, what they do, how they infect the body, how they spread, how they were sold, how they were, let loose in the Black community, and then went to the suburbs, and then, we care now, right? So they have to do all of that research, right? And they lead the class. I actually don't really even teach. They bring the papers and they lead the class and they explain the papers and they go through and then at the end of the semester, they come up with a grand, like a white paper, basically, solution for this. So, things like we should build more rehab centers near to these communities because we found that these communities have the worst epidemic, but they are 20 miles from the nearest rehab center, right? So those kinds of things they came up with. So it's a very different kind of class, and it's meant for them to understand that when we have social problems, they don't define themselves by a subject or a discipline or a major, they're just a problem. And you have to be able to be confident enough to engage whatever you need to read to figure out how to address it. So I know it's a long answer to the question, but it's just a very different kind of class. And you know, we practice apophatic listening, which is a term from restorative justice, and you know how to listen to other opinions. One thing I'll tell you we do that I love, it's like my favorite thing to do. So they, you know, it's a fairly divisive, not divisive, but tough issue to discuss as a class. And we kind of divide the class into half, and you know, have one class pick a side on like a sub-divisive topic in it, and then the other half picks the other side. And they argue, right? Respectfully, but they argue, this is why we should do this is why, but no, you're just giving handouts and whatever. And then in the middle of the class, we make them switch. And they have to argue the side that they were just arguing against. Right? And so, you know, so you want them to be able to not just defend, you know, the ideology they came into the class with, but to really do their homework and see the other side and see it for all of its merits, all of the data that is informing it, and just put them into that position. And it's a really beautiful thing. I think they do it in law school too.
That's really cool. I think we've got time for maybe one more.
Mm-hmm.
So how meaningful, in your opinion, are SPOT evaluations? And in case you don't use the same acronym, that stands for Student Perceptions of Teaching, I believe. It's like the student evaluations on teacher performance.
Yeah. How valuable do I think it is? Excuse me. I think they're extremely valuable, but I think that they should be used in conjunction with other mechanisms to document the academic experience. Now, of course, I say they're valuable, but that means it depends on what's in it, right? So I've seen situations where they're structured really horribly, but I've seen situations where they're actually very thoughtful. I think the student voice is important. I really think any evaluation of the academic experience should involve that. But I always say, you know, if you can do this, there should also be peer observations. And, you know, there should be opportunities for the instructors themselves to reflect on the experience and look at those observations and look at the entire sequence and think about what would I do differently the next time. So you know, definitely, you know, have it there, but I don't like it when it's just used as a single metric to measure teaching.
Well, thank you for that very thoughtful answer and for the talk in general. It's been great, but we are reaching the end of our time. So next up, there will be a meeting with the graduate students that will take place at 2. So any graduate students that are still listening, feel free to join in on that. And I'd like to thank you on behalf of everybody that's here at the moment.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan. We're so grateful for your time with us.
No problem. I'll see the grad students at 2.
Have a great afternoon.
You too. Take care.
Thanks, Bryan. Fabulous.
Thanks, Mike. Take care.
I'm going to be in touch.